Senate Finance Committee during this session. Will you call the roll?
The roll is open, sir.
All right, sir, do we have a quorum? All right, thank you very much. Before we start the agenda today, I just would like to introduce those who are providing significant support to us. We're very fortunate to have back our counsel, Lisa Wallmeyer. Lisa, thank you for joining us again, and we'll torture you. We have a committee intern who is a graduate of Kenyon College, and we're delighted to have Matthew Rushkan with us. Matthew? Where are you, Matthew? He missed his time in the headlines. Well, maybe we'll hold him out. We have another very new freshman member that's providing some guidance and support to us, and that is John Garrett. For those of you who don't know him, we're looking forward to working with you, sir.
Likewise.
In the page support, which we are delighted to have, we have Stuart Payne from Albemarle County, who is in Henley Middle School and is in the 8th grade, right? Stuart, nice to have you, my friend. And next, which was a challenge on the floor, which will be a challenge once again, but it doesn't mean that we are any less affectionate and appreciative of you. Rachel Panukolo, how do you pronounce that? Speak in the microphone, son. Okay, maybe in 2 or 3 years when you're graduating from high school, I'll get it right. But thank you so very much for being with us. We appreciate it. The first non-member that has a bill before us today is Senator Lewis from downtown Accomack. Good morning, Linwood. How are you, sir?
Thank you.
Is it the
Everybody? Okay, yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Had a constitutional amendment on the ballot this year, which enabled us to enable localities to provide real estate tax relief for voluntary resiliency efforts by the citizens of localities. And so what you have before you today is the enabling legislation. And what we've tried to do is put up some very modest guardrails to localities, and we've left as much as possible to the discretion of the localities. If they choose, and of course this is all voluntary, if they choose to provide this real estate tax relief for citizens who undertake these efforts. So you'll see it applies, as the constitutional amendment set forth, to improved real estate subject to recurrent flooding. We've got existing structures that exist as of July 1, 2018. The idea is there was some confusion as to whether we were trying to encourage or facilitate development in frequently flooded areas, and that was not the case. The language, I think, of the constitutional amendment was fairly clear as to that fact, but we've sort of reemphasized that here in the enabling legislation. And then the rest is all permissive, sets out what may be included, specific areas, property values, income limitations, all of which are discussions that will be had at the local level if localities choose to implement this tool in the toolbox as we seek to encourage resiliency efforts. That's it, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Lewis, bottom line is we're basically codifying the constitutional amendment.
Yes, sir.
Is that,
yes, sir.
That
would be correct.
All right. Does any member of the committee have any questions of Senator Lewis? Is anybody in the public who'd like to speak in favor of Senate Bill 1588?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, ma'am. Come right up. Linwood.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Oh, I'm sorry.
Good morning, Chairman. How are you? Members of the committee. This is Peggy Sander from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. We support the bill. We think it strikes an appropriate balance between giving localities the authority to do appropriate resiliency efforts and also not to encourage new development in flood zones. So thank you very much. We think it's a good bill.
Thank you for being with us this morning. Is there anyone who is opposed to the bill? If not, ladies and gentlemen, Senate Bill 5.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And maybe this is for Senator Lewis or staff, but
What happens since there is a constitutional amendment if this does not pass? What status are we in without the legislation?
Well, I mean, Mr. Chairman, Senator Dugal, it's my understanding we need enabling legislation. Otherwise, we just have the ability, as per the constitutional amendment, to give this tool to localities. That's my understanding.
Is that accurate?
Does that answer your question,
Yeah,
Senator Dugal?
does Lisa think the same?
Mr. Chairman, I believe the constitutional amendment as passed said that the General Assembly may authorize, so I believe this would require enabling legislation for anything to go forward.
That's correct.
Any further questions? If not, Senate Bill 1588 is before the committee. It's been moved and seconded that Senate Bill 1588 be reported. Is there any discussion? If not, the roll is open. You want to vote?
Aye.
Ayes 14, noes 2.
All right.
Congratulations.
Thank,
Session.
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. Chap is here, but I don't see he's got a bill.
He's here, Mr.
Pardon?
Stewart has Bill, he's here.
No, I said Chap is sitting out there.
Oh, he must be just monitoring us, waiting on us, the stuff we're gonna share later.
All right. Senator Stewart, are you feeling up to presenting Senate Bill 1270, or you want me to pass, sir? Absolutely. Absolutely pass? Welcome back from The Walking Dead, sir.
I'm recovering from the goose flu. I'm kidding, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. This is the enabling legislation. Senate Bill 1270 is the enabling legislation for the constitutional amendment that we passed, that the voters passed in November regarding allowing a surviving spouse of a disabled veteran to move to a different residence. It doesn't create any new categories or difficulty for the locality. It just allows them to go to a different residence other than the one they're living in if they choose to move.
Does any member of the committee have any questions of Senator Stewart regarding Senate Bill 1270 on the property tax exemption for disabled veterans or surviving spouses? If not, is there anyone in the audience who would like to speak in favor of the bill? If not, is there anyone who would like to speak in opposition to the bill?
Not in opposition.
Just
Wanted
make
to
a
raise
point.
a concern.
And I always thought you were a patriot.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Neil Manx representing the Virginia Municipal League. We do not oppose the bill. We just wanted to point out to you all that this particular exemption, unlike the ones for the survivors of soldiers killed in action or the survivors of first responders killed in the line of duty, does not have a methodology cap regarding how much the value of the tax exemption. Those methodology caps, because it came out of this committee, basically state that the value of the exemption is equal to the average assessment of a single residence within that locality, and that if the property assessment exceeds that average assessment, then the taxpayer does pay on that increment. This particular benefit dealing with the disabled veterans, 100%, just is a 100% tax exemption. We just think that's out of kilter.
Have you discussed that with Senator Hanger?
Well,
Excuse me, Senator
We
Stewart.
would have, but he was ill yesterday, and so I apologize. We didn't get a chance to talk in person regarding it.
Senator Stewart, do you have any thought or no thought?
Mr. Chairman, he's exactly correct. And I wish we'd have had this discussion 2 years and 4 months ago. And perhaps we could have changed that constitutional amendment that we sent to the voters to reflect VML's concerns. But at this point, we're looking at a new constitutional amendment. This is the enabling legislation for what actually passed and what the voters voted for. And, you know, frankly, it may be a little bit generous, and we may have to revisit this going down the road. But we're talking about folks that, by and large, some people maybe are well-to-do, but by and large, the surviving spouses of these veterans are not.
Let
And
me
those are
ask
the ones
Lisa
we're
a
trying to help.
question. Lisa, can we put some codification language in there that is inconsistent with the constitutional, I know the answer, Richard, the constitutional amendment that was passed? Thank you. I always check with my lawyer, Senator Stewart. All right, thank you, Neil.
Mr. Chairman.
Anyone else want to comment? All right, if not, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, Senate Bill 1270 is before us.
Move to report.
It's been moved and seconded that Senate Bill 1270 be reported. Is any discussion? Hearing none, if you'd open the roll, please. If you report the vote, please.
Yea, 16, no, 0.
Senate Bill 1270 is reported. Next is Senator Hanger has three bills. Senate Bill 1318, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. First up is Senate Bill 1318. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, there's a provision in statute that requires the governor, when he presents the budget, to also present any capital bond bills that will be paid for with the full faith and credit of the Commonwealth. And discussing this with the Director of Legislative Services, Mr. Vucci, that is not always complied with, and he thought it would be a better process if we were to make the requirement that this accompanying bill be shared as a pre-file bill with the chairs of the House Appropriations, Senate Finance, to ensure that it was done in a timely manner. So it would be the requirement that would be that this capital bond bill be a pre-file bill and that it be shared with the chairs of the standing Finance and Appropriation Committees. And that's what the bill does.
Senator Hanger, is this a governor's bill or a Department of Legislative Services?
This was not an administration bill. This was a bill at the initiative of the Director of Legislative Services, who is a well-versed person on finance policy.
Any member of the committee have any questions of Senator Hanger on Senate Bill 1318? If not, is anyone in the audience who wants to speak in favor of the bill? Anyone who wants to speak in opposition to the bill? If not, ladies and gentlemen, Senate Bill 1318 is before you. It's been moved and seconded that Senate Bill 1318 be reported. Any discussion? Hearing none, if you'd open the rolls, please. If you report the vote, please.
Yeas 15, noes 1.
Nays 16, no one. The bill 1318 is reported. Your next bill, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next bill, Senate Bill 1319, is the 9C revenue bond bill, which actually at this time has only one project on it, and that is for Radford University for an apartment complex that they are acquiring, which will be paid for from student fees for rental. The amount is a little over $17 million. At this point, we're not aware of any additions in the process. It moves through the process over to the House. Perhaps something else will surface, but at this point, that's the only project on the bill.
Okay. Any member of the committee have any questions of Senator Hanger regarding Senate Bill 1319? Anyone in the audience who excuse me, Senator Obenchain.
Is this going to take this property off of the Radford tax rolls?
Sure.
It's my understanding that this particular property is already owned by the foundation.
Okay.
So it would not, is already off the tax rolls.
All right. have a particular sensitivity to that issue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chairman,
Senator McDougal.
Senator Hanger, I just noticed this has an emergency clause, so are you planning on moving it through quickly and this being the only provision in it that moves through with an emergency?
Actually, I hadn't focused on the fact this had an emergency clause on it. Does it?
Yes, April.
Mr. Chairman, the 9C bills typically come over with an emergency clause on them. That's standard. That's the way
Standard,
they
okay.
they come over that way.
Okay. And I would presume, and I had missed that, Senator McDougal, but it would still go through the regular process, and the emergency would not be as much emergency as some of our emergency bills, but it would, by the end of the session, upon the governor's signature, it could move forward.
Mr. Chairman, maybe
Senator
this
McDougal.
is more editorial than statement. I think the reason I was asking about emergency, if this is the one project that's moving forward, I feel comfortable, but I just would have some concerns if we started to Christmas tree this one with other things. I might not be so excited about it.
Right, okay.
Anyone in the audience who wants to speak in favor of the bill? Anyone who wants to speak in opposition? If not, ladies and gentlemen, the committee, Senate Bill 13 and 19 is before the committee. Been moved and seconded, Senate Bill 1319 be reported. Any discussion? Hearing none. If you'd open the roll. Report the outcome, please, sir.
Yea, 16, no, 0.
Senate Bill 1319 is reported. Senator Hanger, I believe your last bill is Senate Bill 1323, sir.
Senate Bill 1323, which we will have a technical amendment to offer on that. A brief explanation. This is the capital outlay plan. It's a part of the capital budgeting process that we developed a number of years ago. It basically outlines all of the projects that we propose to be funded, at least partially, from general funds. It includes 57 projects currently. In the past, we've had some issues with matching our list up with the House list. It's my hope that this year we'll be able at least to get it in conference and resolve that so that we have a good working document that is inclusive of all the projects that we want queued up in the queue for potential general fund supported bonds. The amendment, Mr. Chairman, it was left off, and I think Lisa has prepared that. It didn't include the statutory requirement that previously funded or authorized projects be included, and I would we're not doing that?
That's not the amendment that was requested.
What is
Lisa,
the
do you
amendment?
have an amendment?
Yes, sir.
Does
Mr.
it pertain to
Chairman.
Virginia State University?
Yes, sir.
Could you report it, please?
On line
That's one.
55.
Okay.
On line 55, Virginia State University, the project to demolish, replace Daniel Gym, instead of being a project from $25 million and $1 to $50 million, it should be from $75 million and $1 to $100 million.
We're very serious.
Okay. Well, I would move that amendment then, Mr. Chairman.
The amendment, as reported by Lisa, has been moved and seconded. Is any discussion? It's a correction amendment for Virginia State University on line 45. If not, all those in favor of adopting the amendment as presented, please signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, the amendment is adopted.
Mr. Chairman, then I would have a question for staff. We do not need that other amendment?
Senator Hanger, the amendment just points out that the governor has ignored that particular section of the code when they submit their plan, but that has been the standard operating practice the last several years. It's just we were pointing out to both chairmen that that is inconsistent with the
Okay.
code.
Something for us to talk about.
Anyone in the audience who'd like to speak in favor of Senate Bill 1323 as amended? Seeing none, anyone who has a contrary opinion? If not, ladies and gentlemen, the committee, Senate Bill 1323 as amended is before the committee.
Move to report, Mr. Chairman.
It's been moved and seconded. Senate Bill 1323 as amended be reported. Any discussion? Hearing none, if you'd open the roll, please. If you report the outcome, please, sir.
14 noes 1.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The bill is reported. Any other matters to come before the committee? That would be very nice. The staff is very generously prepared to provide a briefing and overview for us, so we anxiously look forward to hearing from you in that regard.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. The governor's proposed budget amendments reflect substantial upward adjustments in both resources and
Is that
proposed
under
spending.
tab 6 in our little notebooks here?
Tab 6.
Thank you.
The revenue adjustments reflect both modest growth in ongoing economic sources, $548.2 million over the biennium, and more than $1 billion in resources from tax policy actions that are assumed in the introduced amendments. When combined with FY18 surplus, economic growth and tax policy actions, resources total more than $2.1 billion over the 2 years. Proposed changes in operating spending total roughly $2.1 billion over the biennium, and I'll point out, Mr. Chairman, that of the ongoing additional revenue, $548 million, more than 80% of that would cover the growth in the Medicaid forecast of $462.5 million. Moving on to the revenue outlook, the budget does assume $1.59 billion in additional general fund revenue collections. That includes the $548 million revenue growth. The forecast does include the non-withholding collar, which removes $207 million in the first year and $214 million in the second year. Just accounting for economic growth alone, the budget assumes growth of 3% in the first year and 3.7% in the second year. The budget does also assume full conformity with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which results in an additional $1.2 billion in general fund resources. The introduced budget assumes passage of the internet sales tax legislation, what we know affectionately as Wayfair, which adds $82.5 million in general fund revenues in the second year. It also assumes a revenue reduction of $216 million. This would be resulting from passing legislation that would make the earned income tax credit refundable. And the budget also assumes a one-time general fund cost of $27.2 million that's associated with partially rolling back the accelerated sales tax requirement. Revenue adjustments in the introduced budget are displayed on this slide. Additional ongoing revenues from economic growth, which I mentioned, is $548.2 million. Below that, revenue adjustments related to assumed tax policy actions are listed. Those total just over $1 billion on net. Also, including economic growth and policy adjustments, the revenue growth needed to meet the assumptions in the introduced budget come to 5.9% in the first year and 3% in the second year. This slide shows the change in total general fund resources. There's a net change to the balance of $577.4 million. This primarily just reflects the mandatory deposits to the Revenue Reserve Fund and the Rainy Day Fund. Below that is our revenue adjustments that I explained on the previous slide. In total, including transfers, that brings total resources to just about $2.2 billion. This slide shows the total general fund resources available for appropriation. Total general fund resources, total proposed spending. Once you net those two out, we are left with a proposed unappropriated balance of $24.8 million. Mr. Chairman, the governor's introduced budget amendments do include language that, if enacted, would advance the date of conformity to include provisions of the Federal Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And it also has language that would require internet retailers to collect the sales tax, consistent with the Wayfair decision. The language would also repeal contingent provisions of House Bill 2313 from 2013 that are related to dedicated transportation revenues. Mr. Chairman, under full conformity with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the majority of Virginia taxpayers would recognize a net tax savings on their combined state and federal returns. However, as you know, it is anticipated that under full conformity, some taxpayers would see an increase in their state Virginia tax liability. And those figures are provided on this slide. As I mentioned, the governor's proposed amendments include language requiring internet retailers to collect the sales tax consistent with Wayfair. And just as a reminder, Wayfair refers to a Supreme Court decision that overturned the physical presence requirement and instead enables states to require out-of-state retailers, including online retailers, to collect the tax, provided they can demonstrate nexus of some other sort, such as a minimum volume of sales in state. Mr. Chairman, included in the introduced budget are proposed new deposits and reappropriations to the Revenue Reserve Fund that total $789.3 million. That includes a mandatory deposit as well as close to $200 million set aside for anticipated future Revenue Stabilization Fund deposits. Also included in this is $50 million that is set aside for a grant payment under the Semiconductor Manufacturing Grant Incentive Program, which is legislation that you will be considering this session. And there's additional supplemental deposits over $300 million. If adopted, combined reserves, including the Rainy Day Fund and the Revenue Reserve Fund, would total $1.5 billion at the end of 2020. There's also language in the introduced budget amendments which would authorize the governor to appropriate funds from the Revenue Reserve Fund for a number of reasons, including things like emergencies and natural disasters, economic development incentive payments, and any other required deposits that are not otherwise supported by the Appropriation Act. As I mentioned, proposed spending totals $2.1 billion over the biennium. Some of the large spending items include deposits to the Revenue Reserve, Medicaid forecast, as well as $87.6 million for additional 2% teacher salary increase. These are partially offset by some savings actions, $55.2 million from lower K through 12 enrollment, $55 million from debt service savings, and $51 million in slower growth in employee health insurance premiums. This slide reflects significant incremental spending increases that are proposed in the governor's introduced budget amendments. These are covered more fully in other parts of the presentation. If there are no questions, I'm going to move forward to the Commerce and Trade area.
In that area? Okay, go ahead then, Charles.
Thank you. In the Commerce and Trade area, the governor's recommended amendments increase general fund spending by $43.8 million or 19% in the first year and $54 million or 24% in the second year. Also, as I mentioned, there is a $50 million grant payment which is not included as an appropriation in Commerce and Trade, but rather is included as a deposit and a withdrawal from the reserve fund. In Commerce and Trade, there is a proposed $46 million increase for broadband spending in 2020. That's an increase from $4 million up to $50 million in the second year. There's a proposed $20 million in general fund spending for the Virginia Economic Development Partnership for the Ready Sites program. Mr. Chairman, as you'll recall, last General Assembly session, the Virginia Economic Development Partnership budget was increased by $13.7 million over the 2 years. This would be an additional $20 million on top of that. The budget does recommend increasing deposits to the Housing Trust Fund by $19 million over the 2 years. That's $5.5 million currently in the base. That would be $19 million over that. And the budget proposes $10 million in new spending for a revolving loan fund and loan loss reserve fund to incentivize renewable energy development. On this next slide is a summary of proposed spending actions in Commerce and Trade. I mentioned the first four. On the previous slide, I'll just highlight there's some additional spending, including an increase of, or new spending of $2 million for the Virginia Employment Commission to implement a strategic workforce dashboard. There's proposed additional spending in the Occupational Safety and Health Program, and some moderate increases proposed for the Fort Monroe Authority for energy programs and for some tourism-related initiatives. And Mr. Chairman, that's the summary for Commerce and Trade. If there are no questions, I will turn the lectern over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Charles. Questions? Senator McDougall.
Charles, I hadn't picked up on this, but on page 13, the 51.3 million in slower growth of employee health insurance premiums, have y'all looked in what would be contributing to that, and if we think that that's something that would continue, because that's a pretty substantive number?
Mr. Chairman, Senator McDougall, this is not an area I'm conversant in.
Mr. Chairman, Senator McDougall, Chapter 2 had projected an 8.5% increase in the second year, and it's looking like it's going to be flat. So the first year, the current fiscal year, there's a 6% increase, and premiums are adjusted to reflect that, and they think it's going to be flat. That's the projection for next year. There's no way to really tell what will happen in subsequent years, but certainly the trend is going in a better direction than what had originally been estimated.
So, Mr. Chairman, so if I'm understanding that, the increase is still there, it's just not as big an increase as we had anticipated?
The increase is, it's nominal. It's less than 1%. So these are continued savings to the base, if you want to look at it that way. So we're starting next year to the good by this amount.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Senator Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to slide 12, I'm curious. The slide says that their changes have been offered to allow the governor to appropriate funds from the Revenue Reserve Fund for emergencies and natural disasters. How does that currently work? Because it seems to me every time the wind is blowing lately, we're getting an emergency declaration. Where does that money come from now?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Stewart, there is broad authority in Part 3, I believe, or Part 4 of the budget that allows the Director of the Department of Planning and Budget to reallocate fundings from other general funds that are appropriated in the event of natural disaster. We are still researching with the administration the necessity of the language here, since it appears to be duplicative of authority they already have.
They can already
Yes, sir.
send it from this fund?
Not specifically from this fund based on the statute passed last year, but from all of the other general fund appropriations in the Act.
And I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Stewart.
Is there any restriction on that, or is there any sort of, I mean,
Caitlin might have it committed to memory.
because I'm not sure common sense always prevails in this. I mean, is there some restriction with that regard to that authority or the ability to spend this money?
The governor has existing authority under the Office of the Governor in the budget to create a sum sufficient general fund, and it is bound by, there's code language that limits that authority, and there's requirements for local match and insurance coverage for certain things that we would appropriate some sufficient general fund to cover. So there are parameters surrounding the existing authority, but it doesn't appear that for the new proposed authority there would be those same parameters.
That's what I was looking for. Thank you.
Okay.
An ancillary question, Senator Stewart just triggered in my mind. Do we have any update on that ridiculous amount of money that was spent on the hurricane that we were going to recover apart from North Carolina? And there was going to be an audit as to whether or not some agencies had used it to make capital expenditures. Have we had any update on that?
I have not had an update, and Jason informs me that we will have the Secretary of Finance present an update at some point. Tomorrow.
I always admire the loquaciousness of the Secretary of Finance, but when you tell him that at least this co-chairman of the committee is interested in update a report on that, he can be succinct on it. I just want the bottom line.
Sounds good.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Charles, start rolling again.
I was just wrapping up Commerce and Trade, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning, young lady. How are you?
Good morning, doing well. Turning to higher education on slide 19. Again, for context, as you recall, Chapter 2, it included an increase for higher education of about $120 million over the base budget for 2017, as well as some other distributing actions from central appropriations. So the proposed amendments for Senate Bill 1100 would result in an additional net increase of about $37.7 million over the biennium, and there are some other actions in central accounts that are related to higher education as well. Slide 19 shows a few of the larger items for your reference, and the slide on the next page includes those and summary of the other, most of the other dollar amendments for higher education. As you can see, the largest single item in the Senate Bill 1100 proposed amendments is an additional $15.5 million for undergraduate needs-based financial aid, in addition to almost $29 million increase in Chapter 2, and this would meet roughly the 35% of need for the institutions. In addition, the proposed amendments would maintain the new funding for degree production in Chapter 2, $28 million. This afternoon, the Education Subcommittee will receive an update on the New Economy Workforce Credential Grant Program, which is proposed for an amendment of an additional $4 million, bringing the annual amount up to $13 million. There are also two proposed language changes to the program, one to include an income threshold for participants and also to limit any one particular field to no more than 25% of the total. There is proposed additional funding for tuition assistance grants of $5.2 million to meet projected growth, as well as an increase of $50 per student to $3,400. This afternoon as well, there will be an update on the Virginia Community College System's proposed re-engineering of advising to work towards additional completion. And they also have a smaller amount included in the total of $5.6 million for an online apprenticeship curriculum. Proposed budget includes $2.6 million increase for UVA-Wise. $2 million of this is related to now filling an amount in FY20 that had been transferred administratively from FY20 to FY19 in response to enrollment challenges. And then $600,000 is for some new programs to attract additional students. And then finally this afternoon, there will be an update on the proposed merger of Radford University with Jefferson College of Health Sciences in Roanoke. And the budget includes $1.7 million, which is approximately the amount that those Jefferson College students currently receive from TAG. And then about in the middle of your slide, there's a total of $3.1 million for several items, including $1 million for the UVA-focused ultrasound center and several other items, including VIMS Bay monitoring, cooperative extension, VSU graduate engineering, and Jefferson Lab.
Sarah, let me stop you. How much is in there for Jefferson Lab?
The proposed amount is $500,000 additional. There was $500,000 last year, and the cumulative total after the last 7 years is over $7 million.
Sarah, my question is this. We continue to be in competition, I believe, with New York and the Department of Energy, who has not made a timely decision on the award. And we keep putting money in Jefferson Lab with the expectation that it's going to be critical to funding, even though New York has put multiples of $1 million into it. Do you have any sense if and when Department of Energy is going to make a determination?
The information that has been provided from Jefferson Lab is that they are prepared that the next step in the process could be as early as 2019, but looking back at some of the historical materials, it certainly was originally intended to have been a few years ago.
We may want to keep an eye on that funding.
Sir.
Thank you.
Okay, and then below your total there of the additional $37.7 million is a few of those amounts in central appropriations. $8.3 million related to degree production for computer science bachelor's and master's degrees, which has related legislation on the tech talent pipeline. Also, $8 million proposed for the cross-cutting workforce case management system is in central appropriations, and an increase of $1.4 million for the adjustment to the credit card rebates and interest rate earnings that were restored last year. As well, there is funding in central appropriations for the 1% bonus and does include staff and faculty. There are a few other language amendments. I'll just mention those last two. James Madison University is pursuing their next level of restructuring designation for level 3, and there is new language related to including in the 6-year financial plan process a plan for in-state undergraduate students for tuition and fees for a period of 3 years. And if there are no questions on higher education, I'll move on to K-12 education. On slide 23, again, to provide your context from Chapter 2, there was $664 million for direct aid to public education, largely from rebenchmarking updates, prior 3% compensation supplement that had been planned, and additional lottery per pupil amounts. So this was an increase of about 3 or 4% each year. And the proposed amendments would result in a net increase of an additional $155 million general fund for direct aid, plus $70 million due to increased lottery proceeds forecast. And this is a combination of FY19 and FY20 amounts, including a residual from FY18 that rolls into 19, an additional bump up in FY19 due to the large mega jackpot recently this fall, and then a forecast increase for both years. The amendments do have significant technical savings this time, as enrollment is becoming very flat, almost zero, and potentially dipping for the first time in quite some time. So the enrollment savings and other savings have technical savings of $145 million. And that is offset by proposed policy changes that total $300 million on the next slide. The single largest of which is almost $88 million to increase the previously proposed 3% salary increase to 5%. And there is flexibility for school divisions to provide it either in FY19 or 20. It is not mandatory, and there was a change in when they need to certify whether they will be accessing the dollars or not. The next is $80 million to put general funds into the literary fund to free them up for use for the school construction literary fund loan program. There are 11 school divisions on the first priority waiting list for that. Third line, there's $36 million additional to lower the ratio for school counselors. The plan would be that this would be over a period of time, reducing it to 1 to 250 counselors per student based on the Board of Education proposed SOQ revisions a few years ago. The next line would add funding over 2 years to the at-risk add-on program, and there was $7 million increase last year in Chapter 2. That brings it up to 16% in both years. And there is additional funding for the lottery supplemental amount. So between those two lines, the at-risk add-on and the lottery supplemental, that's about the $70 million increase in the lottery proceeds revenue that's included in the introduced budget. There's also a net increase for K-12 related to the funding from internet sales that flows through to K-12 for the 1 1/8 cent to K-12. It's proposed funding of almost $10 million to continue for the 13 divisions that had participated in the federal VPI Plus program to continue with state support, initially 100% state support for those slots, and then phase down 10% per year to the normal VPI match amount. There's a small amount of additional funding related to early childhood, building on increases last year related to curriculum and classroom observations through UVA, and several supplemental programs totaling $3.3 million at the bottom of the page, the largest of which is the Garden of Tomorrow Botanical Garden item. In addition, in central appropriations, it's not on this page, there is proposed $2.7 million related to K-12 pipeline for the computer science bachelor's and master's degrees. And that is a quick summary of direct aid. I'll hit some of the highlights for DOE Central Office. They have several items, including most of them are roughly about $500,000 for new funding for a grants management system, a new statewide computer science education and training program proposed by UVA, Again, the proposal to automate the teacher license application system, which was proposed but not approved last year. Some additional positions related to audit issues. Additional funding to update the Virginia Studies and Civics and Economics SOLs for the 2015 standards that have been approved. They have not been updated since the 2008 standards. And some funding for seclusion and restraint training, and a couple positions in DOE related to early childhood. There are just a few proposed actions, this time related to the other education agencies, some additional funding for grants to arts organizations, additional funding for the Museum of Fine Arts for a statewide online program, and a small amount for Frontier Culture Museum. And I just have a couple more comments on independent agencies, if there are no questions on the previous materials. Okay, so turning to independent agencies on slide 28, we just wanted to point out that there are no proposed changes to the employer contribution rates to retirement, but Adam will mention a proposal related to retiree health credit amount when he gets to central appropriations. There are several actions on non-general funds in the Virginia retirement system. In addition, there is budget language that would add 3 new ex officio non-voting members to the VRS Board of Trustees. There are some non-general fund actions proposed for the College Savings Plan, Virginia Lottery, and State Corporation Commission. And that completes my portion of the presentation.
Does anyone have any questions of Sarah regarding her various comprehensive presentations? If not, thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you.
Michael, how are you?
I'm very good this morning. How are you, Mr. Chairman?
Well, it depends on what you have to say, so let's see.
Well, I've spent all the money, so so I'll give you the summary of Health and Human Resources. So this slide is just the summary slide. I won't go into great detail, just for your information. I'll just note that for the proposed budget, there is a net increase of about $478 million in general funds for HHR. This is on top of the $594 million that was net increase in Chapter 2. So most of this, of course, is driven by the Medicaid forecast and mandatory spending, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Before I start, I'll just highlight some of the changes related to Medicaid expansion. Nothing substantial. There's just a few things. As you all know, that the actual cost of expansion for the state share was intended to be paid for by the provider assessment on hospitals. So the coverage expansion that took effect January 1st, those administrative costs, as well as all the cost of coverage, are all in this proposed budget paid for by the provider assessment. However, the cost related to the 1115 waiver, the introduced budget actually pays for it from general fund. It's about $13 million over both years for the Department of Medical Assistance Services as well as the Department of Social Services. So that's kind of it's just a question there to raise to your attention as to whether or not exactly what should be the intent there, as to whether the general fund should bear that burden or it should be passed on to the hospital provider assessment. I would just say in Chapter 2, it does have a higher estimate for the cost of expansion. This, of course, these estimates are all based primarily on what the provider assessment would pay for. So it was originally $307 million discussed last session. Now it's about just over $392 million. This number will, of course, change. They're rolling out enrollment now. Based upon their earlier projections, it's a little bit slower than I think what they had projected. So I would expect this number might come down a little bit in the final numbers. And the last thing is the actual.
If I could interrupt you, the bullet on the $13 million in administrative costs for the 1115 waiver, is that coming out of provider assessment?
No, that would be paid from the general fund. So that was what this proposed budget is saying, that all the administration and implementation costs of the 1115 waiver is from the general fund.
Mr. Chairman, so I don't want to belabor the point, but Mike, are you saying that expansion is almost $90 million more out of the general fund than we anticipated?
Mr. Chairman, Senator McDougall, no, these costs are primarily paid for by the provider assessment. So the only cost that the general fund would bear right now is, as proposed, is for the 1115 waiver. So the $392 million is mainly the cost of coverage of just, the current Medicaid coverage expansion. So that would be paid for by the provider assessment.
So, Mr. Chairman, So, so does that mean that the assessments the hospitals are paying are actually $90 million more than anticipated?
Mr. Chairman, Senator McDougall, yes. I mean, there are technical changes to how the provider assessment is done to try to correct more on like a quarterly basis the amounts they have to pay. But yes, if it may be a little bit less until the final numbers come in. We want to ensure, but the current estimate is yes, it would be about 90 million more.
Michael, not to belabor it, but have any of those institutions paying the provider assessment shared with you over what period of time they are anticipating it will take them to recover these upfront costs that they're having to absorb under the provider assessment?
Mr. Chairman, I mean, none have specifically told me for their facility what it would take. I mean, you also have the other provider assessment with the rate enhancement, so it's probably going to vary by hospital and health system. Just depends on their financial situation, but it'll vary across them.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman, so just to finish that, like I said, Part 3 is where the actual the two provider assessments for both the cost of coverage and as well as the rate enhancement are listed, and there are just some technical changes, like I said, to try to improve the actual process, to do it more quarterly, to make it, just to tweak it, to make it work a little bit better, so that the actual costs are assessed in a more appropriate manner. So moving on, like I said, most of the additional spending in HHR is related to mandatory spending. So we have talked about the Medicaid forecast, but the annual meeting as well. So that number is reflected here. We've also previously talked about Piedmont Geriatric and Catawba Hospital. So basically the federal disallowance of funds there and sort of the decertification that those hospitals can no longer be reimbursed by Medicaid. This is the funding that actually continues their operation with state general funds. There's also some caseload and a little bit of change in the managed care rates for the children's health insurance programs, and you can see that reflected there, just over $14 million over the biennium. I already mentioned the $13 million for the 1115 waiver cost. There are also minor adjustments to the forecast for foster care and adoption assistance payments, which is just another $2 million. You see a little bit in the second year, the healthcare fund revenue offset is just the revenues that flow to the healthcare fund or use the state match from Medicaid. So in the second year, it's a little short. So 1.7 million is necessary to offset that revenue loss. Then there's also Part C, early intervention services and behavioral health continued to grow a little bit faster than expected, as well as other things like rent increases that are standard things in HHR. So I just put this slide up as the Medicaid forecast. You'll remember this. This is from the slides I gave at the annual meeting. It's just kind of a reminder, so I won't go into great detail. As you recall, a significant thing that was unexpected in the forecast, which drove the number to be more unexpectedly larger than expected, were the managed care rate. So that represented about 185 million of that total that kind of made the number higher. So moving on to behavioral health spending, there are about almost 30 million in additional general funds invested in behavioral health. The largest piece is crisis services. Now, the crisis services is not all exactly behavioral health. Some of it's actually crisis for the developmental disability population. Then you'll see there's about almost 8 million for increasing direct care staffing at the state mental health hospitals. That's another 254 positions. This is staffing them up to deal with the census pressures as they're pretty much at 100%, close to 100% capacity, as well as then 5.2 million to help for discharge assistance to try to get individuals out of the hospitals to relieve some of that pressure. There's just over 3 million for the purchase of additional naloxone kits over the biennium. Then $2 million to support an additional 150 individuals for permanent supportive housing, and that would bring the total for that program to just over 14 million. And then there's also this newly proposed the Virginia Mental Health Access Program, which is a partnership between the Department of Health and the pediatricians to try to move primary care at pediatric offices more toward integration of behavioral health care actually into the office so that you can address those needs when they come for just regular visits as well. And then lastly, there's a little bit of transition money to move some of the children out of the Commonwealth Center for Children and Adolescents, which is in Stanton. That again, that's the only state facility with 48 beds for kids in mental health crisis. And so they are constantly they're almost constantly full as well. So moving on to the Department of Health. So the biggest expenditure here is an additional $5 million in the first year for Hampton University's Proton Beam Therapy Institute. This is in addition to the $2 million in Chapter 2, so it'd bring the total to $7 million in the first year. There is the next line, there's $3 million. This is non-general funds, so this is from TANF funds. $3 million is put in from TANF to fund the Federation of Virginia Food Bank. So this is actually a new addition to the TANF program to support that. There's also $1.5 million provided for childhood immunizations at local health departments. Then there's $1.2 million to support the obstetrics program at Riverside Shore Memorial Hospital. $800,000 is provided to build a pediatrics wing at the Eastville Community Health Center. And then there's $300,000 to support 3 positions to create a state overdose fatality review team. This will actually review the work of the local fatality review teams to try to get better consistency in their review so there's better data and better reporting on the opioid crisis in the Commonwealth. There's also $200,000 in the first year, very small thing to help support legal fees for a court case that the health department is involved with, as well as some additional funding for certificate of public need, as well as a small amount to support the neonatal perinatal collaborative. So moving to other HHR spending, so this summarizes it across multiple agencies. So the biggest piece here in other areas is the Department of Social Services. That there is funding included to $4.3 million to purchase supplies that they will stockpile for the future disasters. There's $3.5 million at the Department of Medical Assistance Services that will expand preventative services for adults under the traditional Medicaid program. And the reason why this is requested is because in the expansion population, the Affordable Care Act actually required all these things to be covered. So the intent here is to try to make that the current program consistent with the expansion population. You also see money for Department of Social Services for the purchase of mobile device licenses. So this is to help them have tablets in their local offices to help people actually apply through a faster process. There's a variety of things that DMAS related to their call center, enrollment broker, and other activities to enhance federal compliance. You'll see there's additional funding for some of the operations, some of the programs that blind and vision impaired. Additional funding for about $500,000 a year for training for consumer-directed attendance, and a variety of other things, a few other things that you can see listed there. Lastly, for savings in Health and Human Resources, there's just a few items, but they total just about over $100 million for the biennium. The healthcare fund in the first year, there's a large cash balance at the end of FY18, mainly from revenues that were higher than expected. So that comes forward, and that actually offsets general fund state match and Medicaid. You also see there's a $38 million reduction related to the Medicaid expansion administrative funds. This gets back to Chapter 2, where all the administrative funds from expansion were actually appropriated to the general fund. This is really just shifting them to the actual hospital provider assessment to pay for most of those costs. You'll also see in the second year, there's the elimination of the Medicaid state match for Piedmont Geriatric and Catawba hospitals, which reflects the fact that the general fund will be picking up the full cost of those 2 hospitals. There's also a reduction in Children's Services Act caseloads. This is just slower growth for CSA. It's not in private day placement, it's in the other services within the Children's Services Act. There's also, you can see about $10 million removed for the fiscal agent contract for consumer-directed services. But this is because in the move to managed care, the managed care companies will assume that the fiscal agent responsibilities for consumer direction. And lastly, you'll see there are a few other minor adjustments, savings within HHR. So with that, Mr. Chairman, unless there are any questions.
Okay. Does any member of the committee have any questions of Michael regarding his presentation on HHR? If not, thank you very much. We're looking forward with great anticipation from Caitlin on public safety. How are you this morning?
I'm well, Mr. Chairman. How are you?
I want you to be terrific this morning.
Okay, I'm terrific then. Okay, as an overview, the introduced budget would add $41.2 million and 155 positions from the general fund over the biennium. The largest proposals are for inmate health care, which includes staffing for Fluvanna Correctional Facility and electronic health records at the women's facilities, forensic science, and school safety at DCJS. So for corrections, the introduced budget would add $6 million for the estimated inflation of off-site health care and prescription drug costs. For reference, the amount in Chapter 2 shows the net total of the reduction that was done for Medicaid expansion and the addition of $38.4 million that was added in Chapter 2 for the estimated inflation costs in that year. The next row down shows the proposal for Fluvanna Correctional Center. In response to the federal settlement agreement, the department plans to bring healthcare services in-house with DOC-hired medical staff, as well as increase staffing levels. The proposal would add $12.9 million over the biennium to hire 123 full-time medical staff. This is in comparison to 67 FTEs that were allocated to the facility by the vendor Armor. As of last week, DOC indicated it had hired 56 of the planned 123 positions, which includes 12 registered nurses and a medical director. So this is in addition to about $11 million per year that's already in the base for Fluvanna. There is also a proposal to implement electronic health records at the women's facilities. There's $3.5 million general fund in the budget. That's in addition to $3.1 million non-general fund. That's proposed. There would be additional funding required in 2021 for full implementation, as well as ongoing operating costs thereafter. Sorry, I'm not finished with DOC. And then there's a note that the budget includes 5 positions and funding to hire discharged military personnel, military medical personnel through the Military Medics and Corpsmen program. There's $1.1 million in the second year for a salary differential of $2,675 for all correctional staff at Augusta Correctional Center, which has a higher turnover vacancy rate than the facility-wide rate, which is 8%, and Augusta has a 24% turnover vacancy rate. And finally, there's a proposed increase to the bed capacity of the CCAP program, which provides substance abuse treatment for probationers. The adopted budget for Chapter 2 added 100 beds to this program, and this proposal would add an additional 250 beds for a total of 350. And there is a proposal to fund the state share of a Board of Corrections approved jail project and funding for the correctional bed space related to 6 bills the governor is supporting. This slide covers the Department of Forensic Science, and because I covered it at the annual meeting, I won't go into too much detail, but $3.3 million is being proposed to backfill the $1.7 million that was transferred out of 2020 into 2019 to address opioid case backlogs. So the $1.7 million is needed to continue at fiscal year 20 operations for what we had budgeted in Chapter 2, and then the additional amount is needed to continue the initiatives that were started in 2019 into 2020 by the administrative action. And not included in this chart, but noted at the bottom, the introduced budget also adds $500,000 general fund in the second year for biology and toxicology laboratory supplies, because the budgets have added additional staff in those sections in the past, and they're able to get through more cases in a fiscal year. So to wrap up public safety, as I mentioned before, there's $3.3 million under DCJS to add staff and training capabilities related to school safety. This funding includes the estimated funding necessary to train all SROs within 12 months of employment, a contract with the University of Virginia to continue the school climate survey, and active shooter training for SROs and non-law enforcement personnel, and a threat assessment case management tool to track threat assessments in public schools. Under state police, there's funding to increase the amount for the MedFight partnership with Chesterfield County, and increased operational support for STARS and ComLink that's in addition to the proposed capital funding to replace both those systems. There's also operating support for state police in relation to two pieces of legislation that would require universal background checks for gun sales and implement an extreme risk threshold for access to firearms. And there is funding in capital outlay to construct a new area office in Bridge County. And then under DMA, there is $1.5 million to increase tuition assistance grants for the National Guard and funding to conduct cybersecurity assessments for other agencies. And finally, under VDEM, there is funding to increase training capabilities and special operations teams that will be deployed during non-declared disaster events. And we've discussed the language under the revenue cash reserve to appropriate from it from natural disasters. And there's funding under fire programs for 2 positions and funding under ABC to open 9 additional stores in addition to the 8 that were authorized in Chapter 2 for a total of 17. And if there are no questions, that concludes public safety.
I thank you, Caitlin. Does any member of the committee have any questions of her regarding the presentation of public safety? If not, let's hear what Veterans and Defense Affairs.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. And I am great and glorious in every way. There are a small handful of proposals in the Department of Veterans Affairs, primarily around staffing. And as a general theme in the budget, there are around 1,100 new positions that would be authorized in the bill as introduced. So within the Department of Veterans Affairs, there's approximately $600,000 for 8 additional staff in the Veteran and Family Support Program, another $500,000 for 5 positions within the Veterans Benefits section, another $400,000 for 4 additional positions in Veterans Workforce, and $140,000 for a new deputy director.
Do they need all these FTEs?
Mr. Chairman, I have asked Secretary Hopkins, you may be familiar with Executive Order 20, which transferred the functional responsibility for the Department of Military Affairs and over to Veterans, and I've been working with him on trying to prioritize this and the staffing request at both of those agencies. Turning to agriculture and forestry, many of you were in the subcommittee this morning, but again, this is primarily a small spending area that is staffing focused primarily. One role at VDAX for an animal care coordinator position for animal emergency response programs, $500,000 to staff 3 authorized FTE positions within the forestry programs that are hardwood conservation, watershed program manager, and an easement coordinator. There is a proposal for $200,000 to expand broadband capacity at 5 regional forestry offices, and there is a proposal from Forestry in partnership with UVA to get $4.3 million in an agreement from UVA to purchase new land and relocate an existing equipment facility within the Charlottesville area. At Natural Resources, this is where most of the spending in the economic development natural resources world is. There is a proposal to spend $108.8 million total general fund over the biennium in the Water Quality Improvement Fund. This is bifurcated between the $73.8 million mandatory or deposit to the fund from the balances in the revenue over forecast and the agency balances from the close of fiscal year 18. And there is a supplemental proposal for $35 million over the biennium from limited time revenues to pay for a supplemental deposit to WQIF. I would note that none of the language in the introduced specifically earmarks any of the new spending proposals to those tax policy decisions, although the revenue is temporal. There is a proposal for $50 million to be deposited to the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund. This would be on top of the $20 million that was included in fiscal year 19 in Chapter 2. There is a proposal for $25 million in bond proceeds for the Alexandria CSO. It was proposed at $20 million last year. And then there is a proposal to double the amount of land conservation program funding from 5.75 by adding $11 million at the VLCF. The funding for battlefield protection and farmland preservation remains unchanged. Other smaller natural resource spending includes $300,000 in the dam safety program, funding for the operations of the Daniel Boone Interpretive Center at DCR, limited operational and opening funding for the Clinch River State Park, a new proposal for a Lewis and Clark Trail organization to be based out of Natural Bridge State Park. There is a proposal for $1.4 million and additional positions at DEQ for regulatory enforcement, about $1 million for website upgrades at DEQ, $100,000 for improved community outreach, and $1 million at the Marine Resources Commission for oyster restoration and replenishment activities. That's natural resources. Any questions? I will move into transportation. Transportation has one significant proposal and a number of technical changes. The significant general fund proposal is the one-time deposit of $75 million general funds to the Transportation Infrastructure Bank. The language in the introduced suggests that the funding could be used for startup costs related to the proposed 81 toll road expansion. There is an increase through language to reflect the 13th enactment clause of House Bill 2313 that increases the amount of dedicated funding from Transportation Trust Fund dollars from $9 million to $20 million going to the Route 58 Corridor Improvement Program. There are a number of adjustments to total revenues. I will point out the bottom line technical adjustments that total $915.8 million do not actually result in any additional funding for transportation. They are an accounting recommendation of the Department of Accounts based on several audits that APA and DOA had looked at with regards to how federal dollars are being booked and expended. At the Department of Motor Vehicles, there is a real property authorization for 2 customer service centers. One is to acquire the existing Emporia through a lease purchase agreement. This is the opportunity for them to purchase at the end of the lease, and an authorization to seek a new new customer service facility in Sterling. At VDOT, there is language that would authorize the sale of VDOT's Lexington area headquarters to the City of Lexington at fair market value. And at the Port Authority, there is a recommendation for $5.3 million from port terminal revenues to upgrade cargo handling equipment consisting with the improvement projects that have been going on at the port. Transportation is relatively light this year. If there are no questions, I will turn it over to Adam.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm exceptionally well, sir. I hope you're well. Fantastic. So quickly moving into judicial, executive, and administration in the Supreme Court, there's a proposal to add $288,000 in the second year to cover the ongoing cost of housing the judicial branch data center, which is now in a secure vendor-operated facility in eastern Henrico County. There's also a language amendment to establish a judicial wellness fund funded by a fee of up to $30 for state bar members. And the fund would support wellness initiatives for lawyers, judges, and law students related to substance use and behavioral health disorders. In the Indigent Defense Commission, In the Indigent Defense Commission, there's $637,000 in the second year for the commission to hire 20 paralegals to assist low-income tenants in housing eviction cases, and increased workloads, increased workloads related to managing workload demands from increased use of law enforcement body-worn cameras in the commission. In the state board, there's $2.6 million in the second year to support legal aid programs for low-income tenants in housing eviction cases. In the Attorney General's office, there's a proposal to increase the non-general funds by $500,000 in each year, and this would have a corresponding effect of reducing general fund resources by the same amount in each year. In the Secretary of the Commonwealth, there's $1.5 million in the first year to support education and outreach efforts in preparation for the 2020 census. In the Compensation Board, there's a proposal to revert $6.7 million in per diem payments to jails as a result of lower than projected payouts to those jails. And there's also a proposal to add $700,000 to fund additional assistant Commonwealth attorneys and support staff, again related to the local use of body-worn cameras. In the Department of Elections, there are a few initiatives proposed that would increase registrar training to enhance voter list maintenance, and auditing, add a fiscal administrative position, and those are consistent generally with the September 2018 JLARC report. There's $160,000 to propose to advertise a voter referendum on the Equal Rights Amendment. And in non-general funds, there's an additional $3 million to reflect an award the agency received in 2018 for another Help America Vote Act security grant. And the total grant award is about $9 million, and they intend to draw that down over about a 4-year period. So moving on to compensation and benefits, you can see everything on the left-hand column was what was approved in Chapter 2. In the center column, there is a proposal to add $40.2 million for a bonus for state employees and state-supported local employees that be effective December 1st of 2019. In addition, there is $87.6 million for an additional 2% raise for teachers, which would bring them to a full 5% effective FY20. And in benefits actions, there's the 51.3 reduction in healthcare premiums, and that's the state share of premiums. And again, there was a projected 8.5% increase in the second year, and now it's looking like it's going to be flat. And there's also a proposed $8.1 million in the second year for an increase in the retiree health insurance credit for SPORS and Valor's members, as well as sheriffs and deputies. So this would increase the credit from $4 to $6 per year of service. For the state employees and for sheriffs and deputies, it would increase from $1.50 to $5 per year of service, and remove the existing cap on the monthly benefit. So while the $8.1 million represents the cost to increase the credit, it would also add about $75 million to the unfunded liability. And the overall unfunded liability as it currently exists prior to this is about $900 million, and the plan is about 10% funded. And also add, too, that typically this is something you might see proposed via legislation as well. So moving on to finance, the two first proposals related to the revenue reserve and the rainy day deposit were already covered during the resources section of the presentation. So moving on to line 3 in the Secretary of Finance's office, there is about $175,000 in the second year in one-time funds to study the state's gaming governance structure and the impact of gaming expansions on the state lottery. There's language in DOA directing DOA and DHRM to replace the payroll and HR systems to be integrated into Cardinal, and an increase in the working capital advance from $25 million to $82.4 million. And then Department of Taxation, there's a proposal to add 2 tobacco tax auditors that are expected to generate additional general fund revenues of $617,000. In the Treasury Board, there's debt service savings of $55.1 million over the biennium due to reduction in GO, VPBA, and VCBA debt. In central appropriations, there's a proposal to add $1.9 million, and this is adjustment to the Cardinal Financial System's internal service fund charges for agencies due to a delay in the Cardinal payroll system. There is a proposal to add $1.6 million to cover the state share of healthcare premiums for UVA state employees to participate in this university's health plan. There's $28.1 million included for agency charges related to VITA. So this is for ongoing costs, disentanglement, and transition costs, including the NG settlement of $35.8 million. There's $250,000 in the second year to establish a committee on paid family leave policy, which would study and report on the need for and impact of a statewide family paid leave policies in the Commonwealth for all employers. There's $11 million proposed in the second year for education funding, and this is for both higher ed and K-12 funding for workforce development initiatives. $8 million is proposed to fund the workforce case management system. $1.4 million over the biennium related to the higher ed tuition and fee interest earnings and credit card purchase rebates, and then a reduction of $11 million related to a delay in the Cardinal payroll system, and then $5.9 million for the 2020 presidential primary for both elections and localities. Moving into technology, there's the removal of $61.9 million associated with vendor pass-through payments, which is a reduction in costs associated with transitioning from the prior statewide vendor to the new model. There are a handful of proposed actions totaling $3.5 million NGF over the biennium related to migrating services from the Commonwealth Enterprise Solutions Center, or CESC, to the new data center, upgrading the network infrastructure and expanding bandwidth and system security audits. There is $2.7 million included to purchase additional software licenses for both Oracle and Microsoft. And there's language requiring the Secretaries of Administration and Finance to prepare a report quarterly on a transition plan to migrate equipment and services from CESC to the new QTS data center by June of 2022, as well as authorizing VITA to use their line of credit for approved agency costs related to that migration. And just to quickly go through some of the recent actions regarding the repayment of the line of credit associated with VITA. They've been paying down their costs with the line of credit. There was it went up to $165 million in Chapter 2. So they increased their the agency rates by $28.1 million in central accounts in order to cover the costs associated with that. And then the next year, you would hope to see rates go down to stabilize after they've fully repaid their line of credit in FY20. And that concludes my portion of the presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Anyone have any questions of Adam on his presentation? If not, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Good morning, April.
Good morning. Wrapping up the presentation, I will quickly go through capital outlay. Bottom line from Chapter 2 that was adopted, you had slightly less than $1.5 billion in capital outlay actions. The majority, or about $1 billion, was in the VPBA, VCBA bonds. In the proposed budget, the introduced budget, there's about $806 million in proposed actions. The biggest chunk, that $568, is again in Virginia Public Building Authority and Virginia College Building Authority bond proceeds. Of that, about $97 million is for new projects. It's to support 13 new projects. There's actually some additional funding there of about $17 million, though, where they are transferring previous authorizations from previous projects that weren't needed to that pool. There's also $80 million for a pool of workforce development projects to support the new degrees in computer science and related fields, or as you might be aware of, the Amazon legislation. There's an additional $310 million in bond proceeds for 5 standalone projects. Some of those are significant in size. The STARS, the statewide radios related to state police, ComLink, which is the smaller linking between the public safety agencies, and then that Virginia Tech Innovation Project, which is also related to the Amazon legislation. There's $46 million in the second year from bond proceeds for furnishings and equipment for capital projects that are nearing completion or are coming online in the next 18 months. There's an additional $25 million for the Combined Sewer Overflow Matching Fund for the City of Alexandria. There's $10.9 million in the second year for supplements to existing capital projects, and what that is fire alarm replacement at the Department of Corrections and a supplement for the Kentwood Facilities Project Phase 1 at Virginia Tech. And then in planning, we have about slightly less than $30 million for 8 additional projects. That's on this next page. I won't go through every one. And then there was also an additional $5 million in the pool, but those projects would be anticipated to use the entire amounts in the planning pool. As I said, I won't mention those because we covered it in great detail in the subcommittee, but those are there for your information. And then those big new projects from the 2019 capital construction pool are here on this slide for your information as well, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Does any member of the committee have any questions regarding April's presentation on capital? If not, any other matters to come before?
No.
April and Jason, thank you very much for your team's very thorough presentation. We appreciate it. Look forward to some continued conversation, I'm sure. With that, the committee arise.